Officials say an extremely rare Samnite tomb has been unearthed. The pre-Roman site was discovered in good condition and contained many funeral items, giving archaeologists some rare insight into the burial practices of the time.
Archaeologists just broke open a limestone sarcophagus that had been sealed beneath the streets of Budapest for 1,100 years, and what they found preserved inside the darkness has forced historians to completely reconsider what they believed they knew about love, grief, and devotion at the collapsing edge of the Roman Empire. The tomb sits in the Óbuda district of modern Budapest, buried beneath layers of medieval and modern construction, and what lay sealed behind metal clamps and molten lead was not empty silence. It was a time capsule of a family's devotion, a complete skeleton surrounded by objects that 17 centuries should have destroyed, 140 coins marking wealth and status, and traces of gold-threaded fabric that crumbled the moment air touched it after 1,500 years of darkness. Share this with everyone you know, because the sarcophagus discovered on September 30th, 2025, had never been opened by looters, never disturbed by grave robbers, never touched across 17 centuries of wars, invasions, and empires rising and falling above it. And what the Budapest History Museum team found inside reveals something extraordinary about how ordinary Romans experienced the empire's final days at the frontier. Before we break down exactly who was buried in that tomb, why the family commissioned a brand new custom sarcophagus when everyone else was reusing old coffins, what the 140 coins and intact glass vessels reveal about her wealth, and why researchers believe more jewelry is still hidden in the mud at the bottom. Subscribe to Vault of Discovery. The excavation began months before anyone knew the sarcophagus existed. Archaeologists from the Budapest History Museum working in Óbuda, a northern district of Budapest that 1,700 years ago was Aquincum, one of the most important settlements on the Roman Empire's Danube frontier. Large-scale excavations probing beneath modern streets, searching for remnants of the ancient city that once thrived here. Foundations, aqueducts, burial grounds, anything that could tell the story of what life was like on the edge of Rome's collapsing northern defenses. They uncovered foundations of buildings, sections of a Roman aqueduct that once carried water into the city. 8 simpler graves scattered across what had clearly been repurposed as a burial ground sometime in the 3rd century. And then they found the sarcophagus. Limestone, massive, heavier than anything that could be moved by hand, with the lid still locked firmly in place by metal clamps and molten lead poured into every seam, creating a hermetic seal that had held for 1,700 years without breaking. What nobody anticipated about this particular sarcophagus was that it had never been disturbed. No ancient looters had pried it open. No medieval grave robbers had smashed through the lid. No Ottoman-era treasure hunters had found it during 5 centuries of Turkish rule over Budapest. Nothing across 17 centuries of wars, invasions, plagues, and the complete transformation of the landscape above it had breached what lay sealed inside since the 4th century. The peculiarity of the finding is that it was a hermetically sealed sarcophagus, lead archaeologist Gabriela Fenyes told reporters after the discovery. It was not disturbed previously, so it was intact. That statement doesn't capture the magnitude of what an intact Roman sarcophagus actually means. In most Roman cemeteries, tombs were looted within years, sometimes months, of burial. Grave robbers knew exactly what families placed inside coffins and targeted wealthy burials, specifically for the coins, jewelry, and precious metals that accompanied the dead. Think about what this actually means. The coffin lay among the ruins of abandoned houses in a quarter of Aquincum that residents had vacated in the 3rd century. Houses that collapsed into rubble. Streets that turned to overgrown paths, an entire neighborhood that was converted into a burial ground, as Aquincum's population shifted away from this section of the frontier city, possibly fleeing the violence that was tearing apart the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. And then time buried everything. Medieval Budapest built directly on top of Roman Aquincum, modern streets paved over medieval foundations, layer upon layer of history stacked on top of that sealed limestone coffin until September 2025, when excavators finally dug deep enough to find it. September 30th, 2025. Workers secured heavy machinery to the stone lid because the sarcophagus was far too massive for manual labor to budge. Industrial equipment engaged. Cables tightened around the limestone slab, and slowly, carefully, the lid began to rise. And for the first time in 1,100 years, light entered the tomb. A complete skeleton lay inside, positioned on its side rather than centered in the middle of the sarcophagus, deliberately placed toward one edge as if making room for something or someone else. But here's the first shocking twist. Surrounding that skeleton were artifacts that 17 centuries of darkness should have destroyed completely. 2 glass vessels sat completely intact, 1 light green vase, and 1 small matching bowl, not cracked, not shattered, not even clouded by time, with a clarity that suggested they had been placed in the tomb yesterday rather than during the reign of Constantine the Great. Bronze figurines rested nearby with their surfaces completely untarnished by the oxidation that should have corroded them into unrecognizable lumps centuries ago. 140 coins, an enormous wealth indicator that immediately told archaeologists this wasn't a burial of the urban poor or working class, lay scattered among the grave goods. A bone hairpin, delicate and personal, sat near the skull. A piece of amber jewelry, fossilized resin that had traveled hundreds of miles from the Baltic coastline through ancient trade networks, still held its warm golden color after being sealed in darkness for 1,700 years. And traces of fabric woven with gold thread glinted in the excavation lights. The organic textile itself had mostly decomposed because even hermetic seals can't prevent all decay over such timescales. But the gold threads remained, marking where cloth had once wrapped the body or lined the coffin's interior. Then came the revelation that changed everything about who this person was and what her burial represents. The size of the skeleton combined with the specific artifacts told researchers exactly who had been sealed in this tomb. A young woman, possibly in her 20s, from a family of substantial wealth or higher social status. The bone hairpin wasn't a utilitarian tool. It was decorative, expensive, the kind of item that signaled status. The amber jewelry had come from the Baltic region hundreds of miles north of Pannonia, acquired through trade networks that connected the Danube frontier to the amber-producing coastlines of Germania. The gold-threaded fabric was a luxury item that only elite families could afford. Gold thread was woven into garments specifically to display wealth and status, something commoners never possessed. The objects were items given to the deceased by her relatives for her eternal journey, Gabriella Fenius explained to reporters. Roman funerary customs dictated that the dead be buried with possessions they would need in the afterlife. Food stored in vessels for nourishment, drink for the journey, coins to pay Charon the ferryman who transported souls across the river Styx into the underworld, and personal items that connected the deceased to their earthly identity and provided comfort in death. But the sheer quantity and quality of what surrounded this young woman went far beyond ritual obligation or religious custom. The deceased was buried very carefully by her relatives, Fenius said, her voice carrying an emotion that 17 centuries couldn't diminish. They must have really loved who they buried here. And here's where the commissioning of the sarcophagus itself becomes the second devastating revelation about what this burial actually represents. Gergely Kostial, a Roman period specialist and co-leader of the Excavation project, examined the limestone coffin carefully and immediately recognized something extraordinary that most people would miss completely. It is truly rare to find a sarcophagus like this, untouched and never used before, because in the 4th century it was common to reuse earlier sarcophagi, Kostial explained. Sarcophagi were prohibitively expensive for most families. Limestone had to be quarried from hillsides, transported by cart, or if water routes were available by barge down the Danube, then carved by skilled stonemasons, who spent days or weeks shaping the stone into a coffin and lid that fit together precisely. Most families simply couldn't afford that cost, so they opened older tombs, removed the bones of previous occupants, sometimes with respect, sometimes just dumping them aside, and reused the stone coffin for their own dead. This practice was so widespread in the 4th century that finding a sarcophagus that had only ever held one person, that had been commissioned specifically for that individual and never been recycled or reused for subsequent burials, was genuinely extraordinary. But this family didn't reuse an old coffin. It is quite clear that this sarcophagus was made specifically for the deceased, Kostial stated flatly. Custom-built, brand new, commissioned from a stoneworker specifically for this one young woman. then sealed immediately after her burial with metal clamps and molten lead poured into the seams to ensure nothing, looters, animals, decay, would ever disturb her rest. The sarcophagus and its contents definitely make it stand out, Kostial continued. This probably means the deceased was well-to-do or of a higher social status. The family had money, they had connections, and they loved this young woman enough to spend a fortune ensuring she would rest undisturbed forever. But the third twist changes everything about what this burial location reveals regarding the collapse of Roman Aquincum and the disintegration happening across the entire Danube frontier. Because the sarcophagus wasn't found in an elite cemetery with organized rows of wealthy burials. It wasn't discovered in a formal necropolis where upper-class families purchased plots and erected monuments. It lay among the ruins of abandoned houses in a neighborhood that had been vacated decades, possibly a full century, before this young woman died. During the Roman period, much of what is now Hungary formed the province of Pannonia, and the imperial frontier ran along the right bank of the Danube River, less than a mile from where the sarcophagus was discovered. A legionary camp stood nearby, one of dozens that guarded the empire's border against Germanic tribes, Marcomanni, Quadi, Sarmatians, who pressed relentlessly against Rome's northern defenses throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries. Aquincum grew around that military presence like civilian settlements always did around Roman forts, merchants supplying the garrison, craftsmen making equipment, taverns and brothels serving soldiers, families of veterans settling permanently after discharge. Founded by the Celtic Erivishi tribe in the 1st century BC, the settlement was converted into a Roman military castrum and associated civilian city after Rome defeated the Erivishi in 12 BC. And its strategic location on the Danube limes made Aquincum a hive of military and commercial activity for centuries. By 103 AD, Aquincum was made capital of the imperial province of Pannonia Inferior, and by the end of the 2nd century the city had exploded to a population of 30,000 residents, with public baths fed by aqueducts, 2 amphitheaters for gladiatorial games, temples dedicated to Jupiter and Mithras and Isis, and a thriving commercial port where Danube River traffic brought goods from across the empire. But by the 3rd century, the crisis of the 3rd century, something catastrophic happened that changed Aquincum forever. Neighborhoods were abandoned, houses left empty, streets that once bustled with commerce turned to overgrown paths. And those ruins were repurposed as burial grounds as the city's population shifted away from this section of the frontier settlement. Think about what the broader picture reveals when all the evidence is assembled together. The crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 235 to 284 AD, was 50 years of political chaos, civil war, economic collapse, and barbarian invasions that nearly destroyed the Roman Empire completely. Emperors were assassinated with horrifying regularity, sometimes lasting only months in power before being murdered by their own guards or rival generals. Frontiers collapsed as Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube in waves. Cities shrank dramatically as populations fled violence or simply abandoned regions that could no longer be defended by overstretched legions, pulled in a dozen directions simultaneously. Aquincum survived the crisis. It remained the provincial capital of Pannonia Inferior throughout this period, but sections of the city were clearly abandoned as residents relocated to more defensible positions closer to the legionary camp, or simply left the Danube frontier entirely, heading south into the relative safety of the Italian peninsula, or east toward the more stable provinces of the Balkans. And the families who remained, families like the one that buried this young woman in the 4th century, used the abandoned ruins as burial grounds because the traditional cemeteries outside the city walls were either full, inaccessible due to tribal raids, or no longer maintained by civic authorities whose budgets had collapsed along with imperial tax revenues. The young woman was buried in what had once been someone's home. The custom limestone sarcophagus placed among collapsed walls and overgrown foundations where a family had lived, cooked meals, raised children, maybe died during the violence of the 3rd century. 8 simpler graves surrounded her tomb, other families also burying their dead in this abandoned quarter of Aquincum during the same period, all of them adapting to a world where the old social structures and civic institutions were visibly disintegrating. But what makes this particular burial extraordinary isn't just the custom sarcophagus or the wealth of grave goods or even the perfect preservation across 17 centuries. It's what the family did to seal the tomb that reveals their true intentions. Metal clamps securing the lid. Molten lead poured into every seam, creating a hermetic seal. This wasn't standard Roman burial practice. This was exceptional effort, exceptional expense, suggesting the family wasn't just protecting their daughter's body from animals or casual disturbance. They were protecting it from something specific. Consider what intelligence about frontier conditions during the 4th century reveals about threats the family faced. Germanic raids across the Danube were intensifying. Tribal confederations like the Goths were becoming more organized, more aggressive, more capable of sustaining long campaigns deep into Roman territory. Grave robbery was rampant because economic collapse meant desperate people would rob recent burials for any valuables they could sell. And there's evidence from other Pannonian sites of bodies being deliberately desecrated by raiders who viewed Roman dead as legitimate targets for humiliation and destruction. The metal clamps and molten lead suggest this family knew exactly what threats existed and took extraordinary measures to prevent them. They weren't just burying their daughter. They were fortifying her tomb against a dangerous world that was actively trying to tear apart everything they valued. Then the final game-changing truth emerged from what the excavation team found, and didn't find, inside the sarcophagus. The team removed approximately 4 centimeters of mud from the bottom of the coffin, sediment that had seeped through the molten lead seal over centuries despite the family's best efforts, settling in a thick layer that covered parts of the skeleton and artifacts. That mud hasn't been fully analyzed yet. It's being carefully sifted grain by grain in the Budapest History Museum's conservation lab, and Gabriela Fenyas believes it's hiding treasures that nobody has found yet. "I suspect we could find jewelry," Fenyas said during a press conference announcing the discovery. "We haven't found any earrings or other jewelry belonging to the woman, so I hope that these small items will turn up during the sifting of the mud." The hairpin was recovered. The amber piece was found. The gold-threaded fabric was documented. But earrings, rings, bracelets, necklaces? Nothing. Either the young woman wasn't buried with those specific items, which seems unlikely given the wealth displayed and everything else surrounding her, or they're still there, embedded in sediment at the bottom of the coffin, waiting to be discovered when researchers finish processing the mud. For Fenyas, the discovery transcends scientific significance and enters territory that's deeply, personally emotional. "I was very touched by the care and expression of love that we were able to get a glimpse of," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Even now, I shudder to think how painful it must have been for the people at that time to bury this young lady." That pain is visible in every element of how this burial was conducted. The custom sarcophagus commissioned at enormous expense. The glass vessels placed carefully beside her body. The 140 coins ensuring she could pay every toll on her journey to the underworld. The gold-threaded fabric wrapping her in luxury even in death. The metal clamps and molten lead sealing her away from a violent world that the family knew would try to violate her rest. One thing is absolutely certain. Archaeologists opened a Roman sarcophagus on September 30th, 2025 that had been sealed for 1,700 years and found a young woman buried with 140 coins, 2 intact glass vessels, bronze figurines, amber jewelry, and gold-threaded fabric proving she came from a wealthy family. The sarcophagus was custom-built specifically for her when most families were reusing old coffins, sealed with metal clamps and molten lead in an abandoned neighborhood of Aquincum, showing the collapse happening across the Roman frontier. Researchers believe more jewelry is still hidden in 4 centimeters of mud at the bottom of the coffin, waiting to be discovered during lab analysis. The burial reveals how ordinary Romans experienced love, grief, and the desperate attempt to protect what they cherished, even as their world disintegrated around them. Stay tuned.